Last year, I had my physical appointment at the doctor's office. And so I made my way over and I got in the seat. I got ready to go in and, it took them a little bit longer, maybe like a half an hour this time. Usually it's like 15 minutes, but it took me about half an hour to get in there. And so I got into the office and I sat down and they're like, guess what? You're healthy. And I was like, well, that's great. I'm like, I'm glad to know that I'm healthy. It's like, but how's my weight? Can you give me more details on that? And she said, yeah, you might be like 20, 30 pounds overweight at that time. And I was like, oh my goodness, like you didn't want to tell me that, like right up front? So then I was like, okay, I'm going to commit now. I'm going to set some goals for myself. Next year is going to be a lot different. So I did some research. I changed up some habits. I changed up my diet. I cut out all of the bad foods that you're supposed to cut out. And actually lost quite a bit of weight. And for the first 3 months or so, I was doing pretty good. And then it was vacation time. I went off to Florida, and sometimes we were eating out once a week or once a day. And then other days we were eating out even twice a day. And by the time I got home, I was right back where I started, right back at the weight that I began with. And so I've been continuing on this journey ever since then, and it's been really good and fruitful. But I wonder how many of us are living the same exact way. Maybe for you, it's not the doctor's appointment, it's not the weight loss journey, but for you, it's the habit that you can't seem to shake. You're driving down the road. In a New England fashion, someone swerves off right in front of you. They cut you off, and everything in you just wants to yell, crash out, give them a piece of your mind. You force yourself to remain calm. On the outside, you look fine, look like nothing's happening, but on the inside, anger just burning within you. You tell yourself, you know what, next time, I won't let the emotions get the best of me. I'll do better next time. I just need to have more control over my emotions. But the next time that happens, you find yourself right back where you started. Or maybe for you, it's a thought pattern that you've been struggling with. It's been something that's been stuck with you. You wake up in the morning, you go to the bathroom, and you look at yourself in the mirror. The thoughts, then, they come and flood into your mind. You don't look good enough. You need to fix yourself. And after a while, you start to change your habits, your routines, thinking that if you just push those lies aside, or if you did something, those lies would just go away. But the next morning, despite all that effort, you start right back where you began. If we commit to discipline, we commit to routines, we change our habits, we set boundaries. We remove what we think is holding us back, but then we realize that no matter how hard we try, we just end up right back where we started. Well, we've been going through a series called Centering on Jesus. Or we've been exploring through the book of Colossians, going through it, learning how to keep our lives centered and full. And it's very difficult to do that when this world is full of noise and distractions. And so there's a lot going on. We've been answering questions like, who is Jesus? And we also talked about last week how to stay centered on Jesus for the long run, for the rest of our lives. But how do we stay centered when it feels like we're stuck and we keep going back to where we started? Because somewhere along the way, it starts to hit us. We can change our habits for a season, for just a little bit, but we can never seem to get free. And because we don't feel free, we try to experience the freedom by suppressing our desires. We start restricting ourselves, ignoring our feelings. Have you ever had this thought before? If I want it, it must be bad. But when we do that, our desires, they become stronger. They become stronger until we can no longer bear it again, and we just give in, little by little bit, until we're right back where we started. Somewhere along the line, we've gotten on this merry-go-round of restricting and indulging, up and down, around in a circle. And it seems like there's no way off this crazy ride. How can we get off of this? But what if it didn't have to be this way? Or it didn't feel like our desires were pulling us away from the life that we want to live, but instead they were bringing us somewhere we actually wanted to go? You see, when that happens, the habits that used to feel like discipline for us actually turns into enjoyment. And when we start to enjoy where our desires are starting to bring us, life feels just a little bit easier. And when that good life feels just a little bit easier to live, we won't drift back, going into old habits, into old ways. Why? Because we'll finally start to feel that freedom. And doesn't freedom feel really good? See, friends, that is why we must answer the question for today. How can we achieve a free life when all of our effort doesn't seem to work? Well, the good news is that we're not the only ones to have this struggle. In fact, the early church was struggling in a way very similar to us. These people, they were trying to follow Jesus, these people in Colossians, and they're trying to live this new way, but they ran into a little problem. That their old desires, the old way that they used to live was starting to win and it felt like they just couldn't escape. And they're looking for a little secret ingredient on how to move on and to live this life with Jesus. They were bombarded with voices telling them what to do, telling them that they didn't measure up and that they had to follow the rules. And if they didn't follow those rules, then they weren't spiritual enough. Talk about pressure. So they started to lose Jesus at the center of their lives. And you see, that's where we're going to pick up our text for today. We're going to be in Colossians 2, starting in verse 20. Paul says, "Why, as though you still belong to the world, do you submit to its rules? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. These rules, which have to do with things that are all destined to perish with use, are based on merely human commands and teachings. Such regulations indeed have an appearance of wisdom with their self-imposed worship, their false humility, and their harsh treatment in the body, but they lack any value in restraining sensual indulgence." These people, they were struggling with their desires. They felt like their desires, they were pulling them away from Jesus, and they felt like they just couldn't stop messing up. They'd fall down. And then they get back up again. And then they'd fall down. And then they get back up again. And then they'd fall down again and get back up. And then the cycle started to hit them. There's no escape from this crazy circle. Then the voices would start to pop into their minds. And maybe you've heard these voices too. The voices would say, "You aren't good enough. Next time, just try harder." And all the mistakes, like a horror film, would just play over and over again in their minds. See, this would leave them feeling stuck. And because they couldn't move on from their failures, they started to feel the heavy weight of guilt and shame on their backs. And when that guilt and shame, it just felt too heavy, and then they would just keep falling, giving back in again and again. And then it started to hit them. I will never be good enough. Maybe they're saying something like that. How could God still love me after all of the mistakes that I've made? Maybe Jesus isn't enough for me. Have you ever felt that way before? Like you just messed up too many times? That if he was still with you, you'd just be disappointed. That if God was still around, then he must be powerless to help you. But just when it seemed all hope was lost, they were presented with this new idea. Hey, following Jesus is a great start. I like following Jesus too. But you have to add some rules. And once you follow these rules, then you'll start to grow in your spirituality. You won't feel stuck anymore. So I imagine they looked at each other. I mean, it was worth a shot, right? The other way didn't seem to be doing anything. So instead of overeating, they just limit the amount of food that they were allowed to eat. Instead of being tempted into sin, they just wouldn't even touch another person. It started to work. They started to feel better. They're probably asking, why didn't we start doing this sooner? We just need to add these rules. But as time went on, the desires came back. But this time they were much stronger. They started falling again. And so you know what they did? They made stricter rules. They're like, so now we're not just going to eat less. We're just going to eat one meal a day. They wouldn't even be allowed to see another person. They restrict themselves from doing that. And if they tried harder, eventually the temptations that they were struggling with would just go away. But those temptations, they never did. And those critical voices that they were experiencing just got louder and louder. But what if this merry-go-round of indulging and restricting, going up and down and around, what if that was an intentional setup? What if the rules are actually intended to leave us feeling stuck? For many of us, indulging, that seems like the problem, that we're just giving in too much. And restricting, it feels like the answer. If I just restrict myself, if I just don't give in to what my desires want, then I'll be holy. But what if the truth is that both the restricting and the indulging, what if they were both the problem? See, that restricting is just the religious way of staying on the merry-go-round. See, I was just talking to someone last week, and they were struggling with some insecure thoughts. They said that these thoughts, it would just pop into their minds, and then they would just start telling themselves, stop that. You can't think that way. I just have to just stop thinking this way. I mean, it seems like the holy answer, just don't have these bad thoughts. It seemed like the right thing to do, but it just didn't fix the problem. It seemed like it just kept popping back up again. And you see, that is exactly what Paul is warning against here. He says that these rules that they've set up for themselves, that the rules that we have set up for ourselves, they may appear to be wise with their self-imposed worship, with their false humility and their harsh treatment in the body, all things that he mentioned. But he says that they lack any value in restraining our sensual indulgences, that they lack and that they have no control over how we handle our desires. So what's the answer? Does that mean that we just shouldn't be self-disciplined, that we should just kind of do whatever we want to do? Well, not exactly, because I want you to focus on that word self and self-discipline. See, being disciplined is not a bad thing. In fact, it's actually something that God actually desires for us, that we be disciplined, that we work hard, that we are diligent with our time here on earth. But the word self, when we start putting self in front of that word discipline, it's when we start to take control of the discipline. And see, that is what Paul is talking against. He's saying that this self-discipline that we think that we're putting on ourselves, this discipline that looks holy, is actually just self-imposed worship. That it's a worship that we have put on ourselves. It's not something that God has given us. And so we're carrying burdens that we've just put on ourselves and that we've never meant to carry. It's just false worship. And that is when we start to have problems. And why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem because it's a trap. Paul mentions that in this chapter that there's these elemental spiritual forces. And that these elemental spiritual forces, that they want us to submit to their rules. But then the question comes, well, what are these elemental spiritual forces? And why do they care? Well, there are many interpretations, but many scholars believe that these spiritual forces are actually the rules themselves. That the rules that we set up or the rules that were given to us, these are things that are the spiritual forces that are against us. And so now that we're free, we're actually free from those things. Some believe that's a death to the wisdom of this world. It's like simple logic, as if 2 plus 2 equals 4, or if I go to the grocery store, then I have groceries, or if I follow the rules, then God will be pleased with me. It's like simple logic. Some people think that is what these elemental spiritual forces are, that we're actually free from the logic of this world. But one option that has a lot going for it is that these rules were actual spirits. At the time, there were the stars and the elements and the things that were like the nature itself. And they used to believe that these actually were like celestial beings that could influence them in some way. and somehow they were legally bound by these spirits to follow their rules of the restricting and the indulging. It's kind of like this. It's kind of like that feeling you get when you force yourself to finish like a terrible book. At first, it catches your attention. You're like, no, this cover looks kind of nice, right? You start to read it. Then your eyes just start to glaze over. It's so boring. Every time you pick up the book, you try to force yourself to stay awake. Part of you just like, why am I still reading this book? I mean, why am I wasting my time reading this thing? But because you've already started, you decided that you just wanted to finish it anyway. That's kind of what that feeling is like. But why do we want to remain stuck? Well, these forces, they want us to remain stuck because we won't be able to access the freedom that Christ has already given us. You see, Jesus is in the freedom business. Not only is he trying to free us, but he's trying to free the world around us. And not only that, but he also wants to be in right relationship with God. And when we have that right relationship with him and with other people, then we start to become the image bearers that God intended for us to be the whole time. But when we remain stuck, we're not just ineffective in our ministry, in our relationships, but what we actually are is we actually start to do damage to those relationships. Because when we feel stuck, we feel like we have to just try to break through, and we start doing things we never thought we would do. And then eventually, we start to do the dirty work for them. But the reality is that if you've given your life over to Jesus, if you've said yes to him, then you have died to the elemental spiritual forces of this world. In fact, you are actually free to put the book down. But then the question is still here. Well, how do we do this? How are we free from these elemental spiritual forces? Do I just need to I don't set rules, but yeah, I need to be free? I don't understand. Well, Paul, he actually gives us a pretty crazy answer to how to be free from these elemental spiritual forces. Let's go back to Colossians just a little bit. He says, since you died with Christ to the elemental spiritual forces of this world, why, as though you belong to the world, do you submit to its rules? Paul, he says the weirdest thing, that we have already died to these elemental spiritual forces. And what does that mean, that we died with Christ? Well, Paul is not saying here that Jesus died for us. That is true, and that he did do that for us. But he's saying here something different, that when Jesus died, that we actually experienced a death of our own. And what kind of death did we experience? Well, we experienced a spiritual death to these spiritual forces that try to keep us on this merry-go-round of going up and down and around in a circle. Think of it kind of like this. You're in a courtroom, and you're the one on trial. God, he's the judge, and the prosecutor are these elemental spiritual forces. They start to name every mistake, every failure, everything that you've ever done. You start to squirm around in your seat a little bit. You look up at the judge, and you know that you're guilty. I mean, they're telling him everything. Your face starts to flush as they conclude their case against you. Your breathing starts to get heavy as you think it's all over. But right when you thought that, the judge, he doesn't pick up a gavel, but he picks up a death certificate. And the judge, he smiles and he exclaims, "This person's not guilty." And you're like, what? What do you mean I'm not guilty? He said, this person has already died with Christ. In fact, this is no longer the same person. So you heard the verdict. You're not guilty. You get up, you start walking down the hallway, and you hear those spiritual forces yelling at you from down the hallway. They're saying, guilty, guilty. No, you're still guilty. But they're not yelling at you anymore. They're yelling at a ghost, because the person they're yelling at is someone who no longer exists. You no longer have to listen to those voices ever again. That is what it looks like to be dead with Christ to the elemental spiritual forces of this world. The voices that are in our minds telling us to do better, to try harder, to just set up another rule. And then in the same breath, they'll just give you a temptation to just let you break it all over again, you no longer have to listen to those voices anymore. You're dead to them. You may feel like sometimes that you're still under their control because they still have some influence, but our legal standing in the courtroom is what we truly are. The work is already finished. All we have to do is embrace the freedom that Christ has already bought for us. He's finished the job. We don't have to live in that restriction and that indulgence cycle anymore. He paid for it on the cross. And that is exactly what Paul says earlier on in the chapter, right before this. This is what Paul has to say. He says, when you were dead in your sins and in the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made you alive with Christ. He forgave us all of our sins, having canceled the charge of our legal indebtedness. All those things that we did, those things that those forces try to tell you that you still struggle with, he's forgiven us for those and canceled them, which stood against us and they condemned us. He's taken it away, nailing it to the cross. And having disarmed the powers and the authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. Jesus reigns victorious over every power, over every authority. And when we center our lives around him, we reign victorious too. And that victory is something that can never be taken away from us. We never have to get back on the merry-go-round ever again. And that is what makes our main point for today so amazing. A free life is not something we achieve. It's something that we have already received in the finished work of Christ. It is something that we have already received in the finished work of Christ. What does that mean? It means you no longer have to be good enough. It means you no longer have to just try harder, and you no longer have to listen to those voices that tell you you're not good enough for Jesus. So what does this look like for us? What does it look like to embrace this freedom, and how can we start living out this reality of being off the merry-go-round? Well, think about next Friday night. We'll go back to the driving. You're driving home from work. The day was super long, and you're just dreaming of being on the couch, like getting ready to start my weekend. And before you can even blink, the car in front of you just swerves over again. Your heart starts to beat, your face starts to burn, and everything in you just wants to explode. You remember the same scenario happened earlier, and the voices, they start to pop into your head. Control yourself. Remember this happened earlier? You don't want to mess up again, do you? But instead of listening to the anger, instead of listening to those voices that are trying to tell you to set up a rule or to give in again, what if you stopped? What if you took a few deep breaths and you remember that you've already died to the anger and the voices with Christ? You say to yourself, I am dead to these voices. And you release them to God and you receive his peace. Or tomorrow when you wake up in the morning and you look at yourself in the mirror and those voices start to tell you, you don't look good enough. You just need to fix yourself. Instead of changing your habits, your routines, before you even try to push those lies aside, again, those might seem like the holy thing to do. But what if you took a pause? Take a couple breaths and you remember the cross. Not just that Jesus died for you, but that you are also dead as well to these forces, these voices. And you just remind yourself, I am dead to these lies. And you receive his truth. And then you remember something, that he created you, that he delights in you and that he loves you so much, and that he has made you fearfully and wonderfully made. What if that's the first thought we had in the morning? It's in these moments that we don't just change our behavior, but we start living out the freedom that we already have in Christ. That we already have the freedom. We don't have to suppress it. We don't have to restrict anymore. We just have to rest in the receiving of the finished work of Jesus and the death that we have already received in Christ. So I'd actually like to have us try this together. I want you to start by identifying a prosecuting voice. Maybe it's a voice that was telling you you're not good enough, or you'll never be free, or that God is disappointed with you. Take a moment, think, see if you can identify a prosecuting voice that you have. And once you've defined that prosecuting voice, take some time surrendering that voice to God. Remind yourself of the cross, that it's not just what Jesus has done on the cross, which it all is about that, but it's about that I also died to these forces as well. Then whatever lie that you were listening to, take some time to replace that with God's truth. It could be something like, I am no longer a slave. I am free. It could be, I am redeemed. I'm dead to these lies. You no longer have to listen to them. Now imagine yourself in that courtroom that I was talking about earlier. You're walking down the hallway, and those voices are there, and they're just yelling at you. You're guilty, guilty. Go back, make these rules, just be better. But this time, imagine yourself walking out. You are free to go. You don't have to listen to them anymore. What would happen, church, if we silenced those voices? If we got off the merry-go-round of going up and down and around in a circle again, and we received that freedom that Jesus has already bought and given to us? Well, we wouldn't feel stuck anymore, trapped on that merry-go-round of indulging and restricting. And when we don't feel trapped on the inside and feel trapped on this ride, we can move on from the rules. We no longer have to say, I can't eat this, I can't touch this, I can't do that. Why? Because God will start to redeem your desires. And when he redeems our desires, we no longer have to restrict ourselves, but we start to experience the joy and the gifts that God has given us in the way that he intended us for us to live. Imagine what someone would see if they visited Christ Church and they didn't see people that were following the rules, but they saw people that were following Jesus. If they saw people that were full of joy with the simple pleasures of life, that they were free from the restrictions, that they were free from the indulgences too. Well, maybe they would want to be free as well. You see, that's the reality that we get to live. And that is the freedom that that's already been given to us. Isn't that such good news? We already have the freedom in Jesus. Haven't we spent too much time and energy restricting ourselves, feeling stuck? Let's not get back on that merry-go-round. We're not just leaving the rules behind, but we're moving towards Jesus. As we live out his freedom, watch how he begins to change you and to change your desires. You find that you don't need the rules to keep you from the old way of living, because the new way that God has for you becomes your greatest joy. God, he has such wonderful plans for you, such amazing and wonderful desires that he has for you, and he wants to give you all of the gifts. He doesn't want to hold anything back from you. So go, church. Live in the freedom, because we have already received that freedom in the finished work of Jesus. Let's pray.